How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Agave and Cactus Talk. Today I wanted to talk to you about a conversation that I was having with one of my friends that is a pretty frequent cactus buyer in China. And this buyer, we both grow Agave Utahensis from seed, and we were just discussing a little bit of the Agave Utahensis industry in China. And, I thought it was a discussion that, the podcast listeners, all of y'all, would benefit from. So the title of this podcast is going to be called The Interesting Case of Agave Utahensis in China, and what California agave farmers may learn from what's occurred in the past maybe 10, 15, 20 years in agave cultivation, specifically Agave Utahensis cultivation in China, right? And I think there's, a lot to learn from how this, small but mighty industry in China has developed, and maybe we can not copy but gain inspiration from them and do some cultivation on the scale that they are. So as I was talking to my friend, I was mentioning him. I'm like, when I first started seeding out Agave Utahensis and cultivating it, maybe, I don't know, like 7, 8 years ago, there was a lot of interest from buyers in China, but I didn't have the ability to ship to China at that moment, agave seeds and agave plants. So I unfortunately wasn't able to capture a piece of the boom, you could say, right? Because anywhere from 7 to 10 years ago, there really was a huge spike. I would say since the dawn of social media, right? Since social media started getting really popular, like Instagram and YouTube and all these things, maybe in the late, not late, but in the 2010s, mid 2010s, say around 2014, 2015, when these apps and sites had developed already and matured, lots of agaves started being posted, obviously, and people, learned about Agave Utahensis and wanted it all over the world, which led to, unfortunately, a large amount of Agave Utahensis being poached out of the United States and taken all over the world. A lot of people, they place blame on China, but it really is a global trade and a global problem, right? I mean, I know people that have Agave Utahensis that I can't confirm for sure that it's wild, but it looks very wild to me. And, I see it all over the world, and, you have to question sometimes, well, when these plants look basically how they do in the wild, how did they get these plants, right? But, you can't judge anyone for sure, right? I just suspect a lot of the plants are wild collected and, taken all over the world. But, today's podcast is specifically about the Chinese Agave Utahensis market, right? And what we can learn as California farmers. And it's real interesting because you could say at first, maybe a significant portion of the importation of Agave Utahensis to China was, poached or whatever at first. But, once people saw there was a market in it, there was many legal sellers of it that, shipped it to China with phytosanitary. So once again, it's like I can't really judge any of the Chinese Agave Utahensis cultivators because they could have well gotten a recycled plant that was wild and bought it legally with tags and everything and phytosanitary and got it shipped to China, But I say a significant portion was probably poached at the beginning of the development of their Agave Utahensis market because, it just grew so rapidly, and these plants can only grow so quickly, right? So now I more understand why they have so many plants, because it's been, a decade or more of, huge interest of cultivators in China. And not only China, by the way, Japan and Korea and different Asian countries like Thailand as well, and Malaysia are really heavy agave collectors, I'd say, and cultivators. Like I've shipped plants to all those countries, and it's real interesting, their fascination with hybridizing and creating new cultivars and stuff as well. The Japanese are probably, I would say, besides the Californians and the Mexicans, the Japanese are like the best breeders and hybridizers I've seen around the world. We got my boy Tehran Agave over there in Iran. That guy's fucking doing some pretty sick ass hybrids and cultivars as well. There's people in the Middle East, right? And, in Europe and, all over the Americas. There's people all over the world breeding agave, right? Like, we got Hansen over there fucking making new mangaves every year, right? Pretty cool stuff. But, yeah, this Agave Utahensis in China, the Chinese don't do anything small. It's real interesting. Like, whenever I see them cultivating a plant, it's always like a real large amount of it, and why I kind of wanted to make this podcast was because, I asked my buddy, I'm like, why does no one really from China ask for Agave Utahensis anymore? Like, I couldn't sell it anyways, even if I wanted to, at that moment or whatever, right? But, like, I don't have any plants at the moment to sell. But I was like, why don't people ask anymore? They used to ask a lot in years prior. And he's like, dude, it's, people grow tens of thousands of Agave Utahensis here. Like, some cultivators even have greenhouses on greenhouses of just Agave Utahensis. And I was like, for real, dude? I'm like, I wish I could see one greenhouse full of Agave Utahensis, Like, that would be my dream. And he's like, oh, dude, let me send you a photo. And, he shared a photo with me of a greenhouse that had 25,000 Agave Utahensis. And I was like, damn, dude, that's like just one farmer, one cultivator. And so I was just, amazed by this greenhouse. And, I was telling him, or he was just telling me, he's like, oh, yeah, so, there's no real need for Chinese agave nurseries and, cultivators, or, I consider them farmers, the amount that they're farming these agave. He's like, there's no need to bring in plants from any other country really anymore, unless they're special cultivars or hybrids of Utahensis, because we, have a shit ton of it. And I was like, damn, dude, like, how much are Agave Utahensis, plants going for over there? Like little, one gals, what would be a starter plant for most people. And he's like, yeah, like US dollars, that's probably like $10. And I'm like, $10, dude? I'm like, damn, that's pretty good, dude. I'm like, you're killing all the California nurseries. You're killing my pricing. I'm like, that's legit, I would usually sell a little 4-incher for like 20, 25, dude. So they are destroying America's prices on Agave Utahensis because of their supply. And then I told him, people, how do they make money on it if it's so low price? And he's like, oh, well, a lot of the Agave Utahensis that is not special, I guess, the translation wasn't so good on that one. I'm sure he meant something a little different, because he doesn't speak English, so we speak on the WhatsApp translate, But, or I use a translator on whatever he sends me on WhatsApp, I mean. But then, yeah, he's just like, the ones that aren't special go into landscaping, but, they seed so many so that they can get, dozens and dozens of new cultivars that look crazy as fuck with spines and new types of colors and, new types of growth rates. And he showed me some pretty compact Agave Utahensis, like super baby, like Agave Utahensis sizes, small butterfly agave, which used to be known as, a subspecies of Agave potatorum, but now is its own species. And I think the mountain it's from is called Utahensis, or maybe the city, I forget. But yeah, it's super small, and other ones were super large, like a large Agave Caibensis, but they weren't Caibensis. And I was like, damn, dude, you guys are really exploring the genetics of Agave Utahensis. Like, that shit is really cool. And he's like, yeah, the real money is in those hybrids, And then I was like, what are you guys hybridizing Agave Utahensis with, And he was just telling me some of the cool cultivars he's seen, And I've seen a lot of these in the United States, but, just really, really interesting combinations. And what I always tell you, it's like 100 people could create the same hybrid, but all 100 of them can look completely different. So it's really interesting to see how maybe the climatic factors or whatever type of factors that they have in cultivation is affecting how their agave is looking, right? Especially a lot of the cultivators in Japan, they live in snowy areas, so they're taking agave into greenhouses in the winter and taking them outdoors, and I'm sure that affects the growth of the agave a bit, right? But I was just like, wow, there's some cool combinations. I told him I'm working on combining Agave Utahensis as hybrids into other agaves so that maybe they could be larger and more useful for spirits and wine and eating and all of that. Like, I've made Agave Utahensis times Agave Americana times Agave Montana, and I'm working on my next ones. Hopefully are going to be Agave Utahensis times vente Tonantzin times the Agave Americana hybrid, so that'll be like a triple species. That'll be pretty cool. We're working on several ones. I got different cultivars of Agave Utahensis that I keep around, even if I sell most of the stock that I don't really like. Kind of doing the Chinese model there, right? Like keeping the unique Agave Utahensis hybrids and cultivars, and trying to sell most of the, not boring, but stuff that is, just a regular Agave Utahensis that most people will be content with. Because, as breeders, we're always trying to keep the coolest shit for ourselves. Sorry to tell you that, right? A lot of the nurseries, right, we have not for sale nurseries, which are the place we keep all of the shit we don't want nobody to buy. Yeah, and that's maybe where it could be the reverse, the Californians teaching the Chinese, because I did a podcast on how the Chinese are growing cactus now, and it hasn't hit them yet on how to grow any agave besides the tequiliana. But I believe Agave Utahensis, because it's grown in such numbers in China now, may be an agave they explore the cultivation of, which may be crazy if China starts cultivating at scale Agave Utahensis prior to California where it's native. But they definitely have more supply than us. But going back to the Chinese Agave Utahensis hybrids, they've probably hybridized it with, dozens of different species and created all types of sick-ass fucking new hybrids, with all types of crazy-ass names. One thing I really like about the Chinese is, like, they never have a boring name. Americans, I feel like we name shit pretty, I don't know, it's kind of boring. And the Chinese, they got stuff like Red Dragon and, I don't know if that's a cultivar, but, they just come up with some cool-ass names, Like, the nickname for Echinocactus polycephalus in China, I found out actually is dragon's crown, right? Crazy. That's such a, like, we need to start calling it that. That's so cool. But yes, China just has lots of cool names for their stuff, and unless you follow these people, you really won't know about their cool ass hybrids that they're making, in China or Japan or whatever. And I follow some of these people on Instagram and YouTube, and I don't know for shit what they're saying, but I understand, the cool breeding that they're doing. You get me? And like, they'll put the whole description or the whole video language content is all in Chinese or, a different language, but they always put, like, for instance, they'll put like Agave Utahensis times Agave potatorum. So I understand the breeding, at least, right? So I don't need to understand all the shit that they describe the agave or, their business or whatever. I'm just like in fascination of all the cool shit that they're making, And, that's where Californians could gain some inspiration, right? Because they are hybridizing and creating new cultivars at such a scale in these Asian countries like China and Japan. And I believe that's what California needs to do, I probably know less than a dozen breeders of agave in California. And, you could probably in one Instagram session find yourself, 20 Chinese or 20 Japanese growers, right? And there's hundreds of them. So it's real interesting, the scale of their cultivation, right, of stuff like Agave Utahensis. And I'm just, in fascination every day of the new cultivars and hybrids that I see that they're bringing out. It's real cool. But yeah, like I said, the reverse could be applied, right? Like California can inspire China in teaching them, okay, like agave, like not only could be collected, it could be food, it could be energy, it could be, fiber, clothes, all types of packaging, all these different things, right? And China, for all the shit that China gets, one thing I learned in my climate change classes is that China's like the leader in like solar, wind, geothermal, nuclear, like literally every, renewable energy or clean energy source. They're like the leader globally in that shit. And, when I was doing the podcast on cactus farming, popping up in China and booming, I really saw their diversity of products and like the ingenuity of these Chinese farmers in creating different products with their cactus. So if agave cultivation in China became now farming, dude, you best believe they would be making the best biofuels, lots of really good clothes, and lots of really good uses and utility from this agave, which may actually accelerate the use and utility of all these different ways in agave globally, right? Because if the Chinese are doing it at such a scale, right, and then Mexico will want to be like, oh, fuck, now I'm not going to just make spirits. I'm going to also make a whole bunch of clothes. I'm going to make a whole bunch of energy. I'm going to make a whole bunch of packaging material, a whole bunch of paper, a whole bunch of, all these thousands of uses of agave. And that's where I think you'll get real interesting, right? Because competition breeds innovation, right? Right now, you got the Africans working on agave fiber products. You got the Brazilians working on energy. You got the Californians and Mexicans working on spirits. But once we all start pushing each other, it's going to happen what happened in grapes, where it's going to just be like innovation like a motherfucker. And people are going to, not get kicked out, but forced to innovate and adapt. You get me? And, I think it'd be real interesting, right, if the Californians, we could be more vocal with the friends that we discuss, agave cultivation in China with, that it could be a plant that does so much more than just be a collection. But going back to the Chinese here, the cultivation of hundreds of thousands of Agave Utahensis in the country. This is what California needs, to take Agave Utahensis out of endangerment, to be able to have Agave Utahensis spirits, on the shelf, to be able to have agave. Agave Utahensis has really strong fibers, really great, paper could probably be made from it, really great insulation, You know, the fibers I told you from Agave Americana have been in many studies on strengthening of non-structural concrete. I'm pretty sure Agave Utahensis could hold similar utility. But yeah, like that's what California needs. You know, we need to grow this shit by the millions. You know how I have explained they did with golden barrel cactus, right, and brought it out of basically endangerment. Now there's like millions upon millions of Echinocactus grufsoni throughout California's nurseries, and you know you can go buy them at any fucking nursery that has succulents. You get me? Like that's what we need. You get me? Agave Utahensis is a drought-tolerant plant that requires no irrigation, no fertilizers, you know, no human input really once it's established in its second or maybe third year in the field. And, you know, what that means for gardens, landscaping, farmers is huge in California, right? Because then, like, you could go get a golden barrel cactus at any store that sells succulents. You should be able to go get California native agave at any nursery. You give me, they have agave from, you know, most nurseries carry Agave Americana from Texas and from Mexico, right? And most nurseries will carry, you know, let's see, a Caribbean agave, Agave angustifolia marginata, which is from Mexico. And sure, it's, you know, we've discussed how it's adapted a whole bunch here in California and the United States and shit, right? Like it's naturalized in many states like California and Florida. But the point being that, you know, you should be able to go buy Agave Utahensis, Agave Deserti, Agave Shawi readily. And it should be available by the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in nurseries, right, across California, so that people could benefit from growing it, you know, having it in their garden. They never have to irrigate it or fertilize it, and they can eat it at the end of its life, you get me? Or they can make it into a super small soda bottle of spirits if they choose to, or if they got a grip of them, maybe they make a few bottles, you get me? And let me tell you, at first I was like, well, maybe it's a culture thing, you know, because all the Chinese growers I know, they basically don't, you know, let any seed go to waste or any clones. Like they're propagating these agave like fucking crazy. That's how they've reached such a scale, right? Because, you know, just think about it. Even just 100 Agave Utahensis, if you get, you know, I've gotten sometimes up to 6,000 seeds off one, you know, and most of the ones I've, you know, gotten are Eborospina and nevadensis, whereas Utahensis and Caibensis subspecies of Agave Utahensis are the larger ones and would give more seed, right? But those that I've harvested have given 6,000 seeds, and it's like if you have 80% propagation rates like I may have, you know, that's 4,800 agave, right? Now times that, you know, 100 is 480,000, right? So you could produce 500,000 agave in one generation just from 100 Agave Utahensis, right? And that rule generally is for most agave, right? Like it's a pretty, if you know what you're doing, you can replicate large amounts of them from relatively small amounts of them by taking them to maturity, right? And not utilizing them except for seed at the end. And that's kind of what I was explaining as far as culture. Like the Chinese are really good at keeping all of their seed and propagating all their seed. And, you know, really what I think it is, though, is not a culture thing. I think it's just they have more nurseries and more growers. It's like a lot of the nurseries I know here, they're mature Agave Utahensis. They don't see quite the market for Agave Utahensis. They don't realize like California native plants are having a boom as well as agave, and people are seeking these plants. So they're just letting these plants bloom. I've seen so many Agave Utahensis in nurseries here in California blooming, and then they're just like, you know, tossing that agave away because they can't sell it anymore. Whereas they should be, you know, taking that seed and growing it all. And that actually is the distinction I've seen. So a lot of the nurseries in California, they're resellers. They don't propagate, you know, a lot of plants. And most of them don't propagate at all. They just buy plants and resell them. You know, they buy from wholesalers and will sell it at retail. And in China, very much a different case, where a lot of the agave cultivators, they're growing it all from seed. And that's why they have so much scale now of Agave Utahensis, right? And it's really cool because, you know, like all of these wild plants, you know, they have cool characteristics and they look really nice, right? Which is why many of them are, you know, poached, right? But the cultivated stuff or the seeded stuff also has really unique characteristics. Many of them are grown under grow lights and, you know, are really, really blue. Some of them, you know, are just perfect, you know, like they don't have scarring, they don't have, like, I see that wild form really cool, right? That's why I like to hard grow a lot of my agave and stuff, like have some scarring, have some dead leaves, have some pain and some stress, right? But they grow a lot of it in greenhouses, and it's like in a perfect environment. It's like a beautiful Agave Utahensis that has never had, like, you know, extreme stress, right? They've always been able to be irrigated when they need it, or fertilized, put in, you know, usually perfect soil and shit. That's one thing they do really well too. Most people here that are growing Agave Utahensis just plop it in whatever soil and they're like, hope for the best. But the Chinese are really good about how they're cultivating it and keeping all of their seed, right? And I think that's what we need in California. We need to realize this is an agave that has so much potential, and the people that are cultivating it that may only have a couple dozen plants, if they're keeping it all and seeding it all like I am, within several years they have thousands. Then in another second generation they may have, you know, millions of fucking plants, right? So it's something that could grow relatively quickly. The fact that, you know, Agave Utahensis is endangered is kind of, you know, stupid to me, because, you know, we could tissue culture it, we could grow it by seed and grow it by such a scale that farmers here could utilize it and then, you know, ship it legally around the world, so that, you know, nobody, like now the Chinese don't want it because they've cultivated it at such a scale, but still lots of other countries that don't have that scale of production, you know, import poached Agave Utahensis, right? So getting it to the point in California where we're just growing millions of plants will allow people to ship it all over the world legally with phytosanitary certificates, because they grew it in nurseries, and then be able to, you know, destroy the demand for poached plants, right? So today I told you a lot of 4-inch plants are sold, you know, anywhere from 10 to 25 bucks. And, you know, for the Chinese to be able to give, you know, a triple a size plant for that price, we need a lot more scale in California, right? We need more native nurseries growing it, more agave succulent nurseries growing it, everybody. And, you know, that's where keeping all these seeds are going to come through. And maybe if we could get some of our tissue culture labs to work on Agave Utahensis, right, that'd be great. And I think ranch tissue culture technologies right there right here in California is actually already tissue cultured Agave Utahensis and selling tissue cultured Agave Utahensis, right? So you don't want to wait, you know, for a seeded plant to grow up from people a few years. Go buy some of those, you know. Tissue culture, that's the one place I think it has its use, right? Like taking endangered plants, growing a whole fuck ton of them, and then you take those tissue cultured plants and you seed the shit out of them, collect all the seeds, seed the shit out of them, and then you have genetic variation on those tissue cultured plants, right, that were replicated very quickly. So it has its place. It just, you know, you can't tissue culture forever, a whole bunch of years, the same genetics, because it happens what happens to Agave aplanata cream spike, where it just becomes a pest, you know, like the pest could just destroy it, cochineal, so fucking easily that nobody grows it anymore, right? Because it was all tissue culture genetics. But my point is, if they would have took that seed and then, you know, improved it a few times and got a whole bunch of cool new cultivars, they could have tissue cultured it again and then would have had some genetic diversity. So, you know, there's cool ways to use tissue culture, I believe, right? Chinese are doing it too. So yeah, generally I feel like we just need to build more interest, and that's why maybe I'm making this podcast, because the Chinese have reached that point. They've gotten so many people interested in the plant that now they're cultivating it on such a scale, and I'm sure now they're reaching, like I said, such a scale, they're going to be like, what the fuck else do we do with the plant? Like, there's only so many people we could sell to in landscaping. And that's what, we're starting to reach with a lot of the agave that we're farming here in California. We used to reliably sell thousands of Agave Vilmoriana into nurseries, but it's like they're kind of backed up. They have like a lot of supply of it now, you get me? So, point is, like, you got to go to other countries and shit, and then they run out of demand, right? And then you reach the farming stage, because that's the only use you could do with that plant now. So a lot of these nurseries that grow a shit ton of agave, they should have the farm as a side business, because then it allows all these mature plants, instead of just throwing them in the trash or their waste, you seed it out, you grow more, and then you're like, fuck it, whatever sells in the nursery sells, and then whatever doesn't, we're gonna take it to maturity, and we're gonna have utility of it at the end of the farming cycle, right? And I think the Chinese are gonna realize that quicker than or sooner than later, right? But what I really want the listeners here to learn from the Chinese Agave Utahensis cultivation is that they have no need to poach Agave Utahensis anymore. They have established a market of it. It's selling all over China. Their genetic diversity is high of it, because they got tons of cultivars and hybrids. And this is a great model that they advanced from California, and we just been lacking. And now we need to, almost take inspiration, like we inspired the Chinese to hybridize and cultivate, and then now, we need to take inspiration from them and be like, fuck, we need to step our game up and produce much more genetic diversity of Agave Utahensis, right, to maintain itself. And then we can be farming it reliably. You get me? Creating all types of products with it, which is dope. So it's like the Chinese, they copied a lot of our models, right? Like, just grow a shit ton by seed in greenhouses, new cultivars, new hybrids, and, using the best soils and stuff. And they just took that model from the USA and improved on it, right? And I mean, that now is being really successful for them, right? Like, I talked to a lot of those Agave Utahensis growers in China, and they're shipping, like I said, to those other countries, all over Asia. And not one plant, I'm talking hundreds and thousands of plants, you get me? Boxes and boxes full of them, seed-grown Agave Utahensis, like. And that's what I want the Californians to realize too, that, if you grow at such a scale Agave Utahensis, you could potentially do what the Chinese are doing too, and take it all over the world and have a market for it in many places. And, it's like, I've shipped some Agave Utahensis seed to Mexico, and my Mexican homies that I shipped it to, they're distillers, and they make some fine spirits, and they live in at such an elevation that they can only grow certain agave, and they're like, fuck, Agave Utahensis is small, but it'll grow at this elevation and cold, because it's the hardiest agave we know of. And they're cultivating it now in Mexico, right? So they're growing a California species now. It's like pretty funny. I think I've mentioned that once or twice on the podcast, but the point being, Agave Utahensis, because it could take snow, it could take frost, it could take -20, -30. It could go across the whole world, dude. There's so many places it could be farmed and cultivated, right? And like I said, it's not a plant that you need to destroy a whole landscape to put in, like here in the desert, for instance, you could interplant it in between all the existing native plants. You don't need to get rid of anything. And you can do that, in Mexico too, right? Like a lot of the Jaliscans that are not involved in the tequila, but involved in, like, say, raicilla and, the cultivation of other Jaliscan agave spirits, they interplant in the forest. They're not removing trees or shrubs and shit. They go, like I was mentioning, I'm doing here now. All the open space, that's where they're planting. You get me? And that way they can have their agave growing with all of the native plants. And that's why I want Agave Utahensis to be grown at, the Chinese scale here in California, because, yeah, then you'd see it in every landscape, every garden. People would farm it, not have to destroy their ecosystems. They could be interplanting and all these different ecosystems and stuff. And what better than a California native agave, right? And I've always said the California and the USA industry, you know, it's going to separate itself and develop itself by using all these hardy species like Utahensis, Havardiana, Crescenta, you know, these Texas, California natives, because we're going to be able to dry farm them. You know, we're going to be able to, you know, the genetics are all here already, right? And that's going to be our huge advantage. You get me? In lots of other places, like I give an example, in lots of places like Australia and Europe and stuff, they're irrigating this agave, and they're going to go through the same problems of aquifer destruction that Jalisco and Oaxaca are. You get me? So there, you know, these California and Texas agave, you know, Agave Utahensis and shit, if we cultivate them, we could potentially, you know, rejuvenate the agave cultivation around the world from some bullshit angustifolias that are water lovers to dry farmed agaves, right, that don't require irrigation. Like some of those Havardianas and Crescentas and Agave Americana don't require any irrigation and get way larger than Agave angustifolias. And many of the cultivars grow in the same time frame. Well, yeah, generally what I'm seeing now is, you know, the Chinese have differentiated so much the genetics of Agave Utahensis, they're going to other agaves and doing the same thing. They're growing, you know, Agave Montana at scale. They're growing, you know, these rarer species at scale. And they're doing the same thing, creating tons of cultivars and tons of hybrids. And, you know, it's really cool to see, you know, this shit, like now it's going in reverse, right? Because it's cheaper to buy an Agave Utahensis in many cases from China and import it to the U.S. because they produce it so cheaply than it is to buy one from a USA grower. And not in all cases, but in many cases. That cracks me up now, right? But that's because of that scale. And once again, that's what California could learn, to just start investing in exploring all the species, creating tons of new genetic diversity, exploring them all. And I wonder when the agave farming is going to click for all these different species for the Chinese, you know. But I hope it does soon, because I like some of these cool rare species that they're producing at scale to come here to California so we can farm them, you know. It ends up just benefiting everyone, you know, because like, say they produce Agave Utahensis at such a scale, the Californians could start, you know, if California doesn't do what I'm telling you and try to grow it at scale, the Chinese will just, the reverse will happen. They'll send us 1 million Agave Utahensis plants in a few years. And we'll grow them at scale and farm them and shit, you get me? So, like, if the demand is there. So, point is, someone's going to grow the plants and someone's going to sell the plants and utilize the plants. Who better than California? You know? Who better than California? And I think there's a lot to learn from that model of China. Like, not having to poach any Agave Utahensis anymore. Because, you know, I've seen some farms that, for instance, like, we've talked about how, like, some of these recycled Agave Utahensis are questionable, like they're, you know, the ethics behind the harvesting of them, you get me? And then you got farms over there buying 100 or 200 of those from a nursery or whatever, and I see them and they all look wild grown, because seed grown and wild grown look very, very differently, especially on the roots and on the leaves and on the scarring, a whole bunch of shit. But the roots are the number one indicator usually. And you know, it's not good that the growth of agave farming in California or whatever, say the Southwest, is incentivizing even maybe more sacking or poaching of Agave Utahensis from the wild, or quote-unquote unethical recycling or whatever, you know. We got to adopt the Chinese model and just grow the fuck out of it, you know. I think that's a legit-ass model, you know. And I hope Californians want to start cultivating more Agave Utahensis. You know, it's a great plant. You can use it for all types of shit. You know, if you don't want to use the improved cultivars that are better on size and speed and shit, a lot of the you know, it's already just great to eat and make into a spirit. You know, the Agave Utahensis, because they're relatively small piñas, you need a good amount of them to make a spirit, you know, like a couple dozen. like 1 or 2 dozen and make a bottle or two. But just eating them, man, they're fire. Super sweet, super really juicy, and I need to explore how to explain flavors better, because to me it just, I'm like, oh, it tastes amazing, but I never am like a big like, oh, it has this and this and this flavor and shit. But I need to start doing that for y'all. But yeah, Agave Utahensis, lots to learn from the Chinese, and the Chinese have lots to learn from us, I guess. And that's what I'm seeing a lot in agave cultivation globally. Like, I'm seeing the Californians growing a whole bunch of different agaves, now inspiring the Mexicans to explore a whole bunch of new species that they maybe didn't give a big chance to, and make sure that they find utility from them. You see the Japanese breeders inspiring the Californians and the USA ones to see who can make the coolest agaves and sickest looking agaves. You got the Chinese growing at such a scale, it's inspiring other countries like the Japanese and USA to create giant greenhouses just dedicated to agave cultivation of certain plants like that, or to begin breeding and programs for their agave, right? So every country pushes each other that is cultivating agave to produce better agave. So I see that as a positive, and there's lots of ways where, like California made, I'm sure like Californians, as a whole, probably made millions selling Agave Utahensis into China. And now the Chinese are going to make, tens of millions selling it to the world. And it's going to come right back to us, and we're going to do the same shit. It's like, it's really cool to see, yeah, like I said, it's really cool to see all the innovations of each country push other countries to take risks and invest in different ways, right? Because when I see that, like, I was having that other combo with my friend, I'm like, when I see the Chinese greenhouses, I don't get scared, or I'm like, fuck, I'm going to stop growing Agave Utahensis like I'm beat. It inspires me to build bigger greenhouses, to grow more, to be more innovative in how I build and how I scale and how I, cultivate these agave. But yeah, the Chinese cultivation of agave and cactus is going to push everybody. And I see that as generally a positive thing. But yeah, I feel like the Chinese are beating us at our own game here as agave farmers, and just wanted to alert y'all to, what I'm seeing and discussing with some of my Chinese friends, and, it pushes me to grow more Agave Utahensis and to try to ramp up production of other agaves, and I hope it pushes y'all, don't sleep. The Chinese are getting into large-scale cultivation of it, and maybe they haven't hit the right things that they need to see the farming aspect, but that'll come soon, And like I said, there's a lot to learn from them. There's a lot we could teach them. There's a lot of back and forth every day, I'm sure, between people cultivating agave in the USA and China. But yeah, just like I said, wanted to tell you about how they've advanced their agave Utahensis cultivation at such a scale that, I think they're definitely now the number one cultivator of it. And California needs to take that title back. We need to do some grander scale cultivation of it, But hope you learned something today in the podcast, and have a great rest of the day. We'll talk about some agave and cactus another day, and I'll catch y'all later. Agave and Cactus Talk out. Peace.